Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jackson Alder. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Senior Digital Strategist here at PFLAG National. I'll be hanging out with you in the comments throughout the show, so let us know if you have any questions. And I'm going to bring Jamie Henkel, our Interim Director of Learning and Inclusion, to get us started.
Hi, Jackson.
Hi, Jamie.
You are in a different place and wearing a shirt that brings joy to my life.
I'm a nerd. I will admit it. I'm a D&D nerd and non-binary, and I saw the shirt and I could not resist.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us, and we will maybe see you soon if we've got lots of questions and comments to share.
Sounds good.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Henkel. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Interim Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Thank you so much for being with us for a part of Something to Talk About Live. And this month, actually, as we shift to this new monthly format, we will be talking about bi+ representation in sort of youth-centered or coming-of-age media. And we're using an article from Why Now by a writer named Eleanor Noyce called I'm Bi, Actually, The Disappointing Biphobia at the Heart of the Heartstopper Fandom. And this is a really interesting conversation, and I'm just going to bring our guests in to be a part of the conversation. So I'd like to introduce Mackenzie Harte, Vincent Paz Macareno, and Percy Sobera. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. And I'm hoping we can actually do just an opportunity for you all to introduce yourself. So I'm hoping you can tell us who you are, a little bit about the work that you do, and if you're willing to share how you identify in terms of your sexual orientation, gender identity, or any combination thereof.
So I'll go first. My name is Mackenzie Harte. Many of you who have watched the show have probably seen me a couple times before, but I am PFLAG National's Learning and Inclusion Manager, and I use they, them pronouns. And I identify as bisexual, meaning that I can be attracted to people of genders like and unlike my own, and I also identify as non-binary.
Perfect. And Vincent?
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Vincent Paz Macareno. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an actor, educator, and creative professional currently based in the beautiful city of Los Angeles, California. Outside of my creative work, I also serve on the board of directors of the Bisexual Resource Center, where I'm a part of their Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, and Belonging Committee. And I also get to work on some very exciting projects surrounding bi representation in media. So thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and Percy, it's day 3 at PFLAG. Would you like to use this opportunity to introduce yourself to the folks that have joined us today?
Yes, I'm Percy. I'm new. And if I had to label myself, I would say I am a non-binary lesbian. But I have a lot of experience in the realm of queer media and cinema. So I'm very excited to share my opinions and also be a part of this stream.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm hoping now that each of you would be willing to let us know if there was one thing that you could help people understand about bisexuality, what would it be? And if you have any insights on how that answer does or does not change depending on who you're talking to. If it's to your cisgender and heterosexual parents, is it different from when you're talking to your gay best friend? And I just love that insight and sort of what you want people to know and if it changes depending on who you're talking to. And Vincent, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a great question and one that I've been thinking about a lot as I've been catching up on the series that we'll be talking about today. I would say if I could help people understand one thing about bisexuality, I would want to help them see that bisexuality, like homosexuality, has a history of being labeled as a behavior rather than a descriptor of someone's attraction. And as a result, there's a lot of unnecessary pressure placed on bi+ people to kind of tip the scale, so to speak, and identify with what we would consider a monosexual identity. And I don't think it has to be that way. In regards to how my answer would change depending on who I'm speaking to, for cis het people, I would want to say that one of the best ways to be an ally is to release your expectations and explanations as to why someone is identifying as bi plus, and whether you observe changes in a bi plus person's relationships or not, they value the emotional journey that got them there, and they want you to too. So, and for queer people, I want to remind them that everyone in the LGBTQIA plus community just wants to show up in the world as their most authentic selves, and bi plus people are drawn to queer spaces and people because of that freedom, and we want to share in that with you in our own way. So yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Mackenzie, how about you?
I think the main takeaway that I want people to have whenever I talk about bisexuality is that it is not this one single simple thing to explain. I think that so often as a word gets watered down, it gets misinterpreted, it gets defined incorrectly. But there are so many different things that being bisexual can mean, and different definitions people might have, different language people can use. And so trying to break free of that kind of limited understanding that many of us have, regardless of how we identify. Even some bi people have very limited views on what bisexuality can be, and remembering that it's kind of about freedom. It's kind of about finding language that works for you and how you would describe yourself. And there's so many different pathways that you can have. That's the main takeaway that I want people to have. I do think that I do kind of naturally and often unintentionally talk about bisexuality differently depending on different spaces I'm in, where I might explain it to someone who's cisgender very differently than I might explain it to someone else who is non-binary, because there might be some views of binary gender at play that might exist a little bit less in a different community. Whereas if I'm talking to someone who is more in the queer space, I might be able to talk about it differently or talk about it in different wording. So I do think that those differences do come up, but I really want people to understand that it's a very wide array of experiences people can have.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Mackenzie. I know that's something that you and I talk about with the work that we do through the Straight for Equality program quite a bunch. So I appreciate that. Now, Percy, how about you? If there was one thing you could help people understand, what would that be?
If there was one thing I could help people understand about bisexuality, is that even if bisexuality may be kind of a stop on someone's sexuality journey, that doesn't make it a phase. When I was younger and first kind of exploring my sexuality, I considered myself to be bisexual and engaged in a lot of those spaces. And through experience, I naturally stopped identifying with that. But every time I talk to especially cishet individuals, I feel like I have to throw my hands up beforehand and go, it's not a phase for anyone else, though. Just because it may have been a stop for me doesn't mean it's that way for anyone else. And sometimes I feel like I have to explain that to certain other people, even within the LGBT community. But more of the issues I've seen within the LGBT community that I kind of talk about bisexuality differently is sometimes I've had people I'm so sorry. So sometimes I've had people come to me complaining about other people experiencing bisexuality differently when it comes to playing around with gender, just because I know a lot of very gender fluid or non-binary individuals who have different descriptors for how they feel depending. And it's kind of just what Mackenzie said, which is bisexuality doesn't look the same for everyone. And you may not describe it the same.
Yeah. And thank you for that. I really appreciate all three of you providing those personal insights and parts of your own experience, because it takes a lot of bravery to do that in this format. So thank you. And to get to the article that we used to sort of guide today's conversation in the show Heartstopper, the author notes that the character Nick has to constantly correct people who assume that he's gay because of the relationship that he's in by saying, I'm bi, actually, which is something that many fans find annoying. So I'm just wondering, probably Mackenzie and Vincent, for the two of you, have you had to make similar corrections throughout your life? If so, how does that impact you? And how often would you say you actually have to come out to people as bisexual, or remind people that you feel like should already know that you're bi in your day-to-day life?
I've had to correct people a lot. There have been numerous points in my life where that has been the case. I will say that now, kind of by virtue of the work that I do, that it is a lot less common that I have to, simply because I do a lot of bi advocacy work here at PFLAG. I'm very kind of forthright talking about it. It is a subject matter that I bring up a lot naturally and a lot through my work. So I think that in a strange way, I am correcting people about my sexuality a lot less than many other bi people who aren't necessarily in the space are. But even then, I still encounter people who will make assumptions, or who will still ask questions, even though we've had the same conversation numerous times before, or anything along those lines, where it becomes questionable, where it feels like people aren't necessarily listening. I will also say that for me personally, there are situations in which I do feel excluded because we are not included in language. For example, if something is advertised as an event for gay men, that is something that people might invite me to because of my my assigned sex at birth, and because I can be attracted to men who are attracted to men, but that is not who I am, and it's interesting to kind of navigate that, because that's not who I am on many different levels, including gender identity. But that's kind of a block that I run into, and I run into that in some different queer spaces, both when it comes to gender identity, like I mentioned, but also in regards to being bisexual, and kind of needing to remind people that we exist and continue using that language is where it comes up a lot.
And Vincent, is there anything you would add?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have had the I'm bi actually kind of experience quite a bit. And I can definitely kind of understand, I guess, where some of the trepidation comes from. Even I, as a bisexual person, will occasionally use gay as an umbrella term in reference to myself, of course, or in reference to the orientation of my specific relationship. But the fact is not everybody is comfortable with that kind of verbiage, and I think we need to kind of allow space for that. And I think there is definitely a kind of a wonderful bi experience in the self-assurance that comes with being able to say, I'm not straight or gay, I'm both or neither, you know. And I feel like that in itself is an important kind of part of being bi plus. And yeah, I think for me personally, it definitely, I had a lot of internalized homophobia based on where I grew up as a child. And so for a long time, even though I was comfortable being labeled as bi, I had a hard time saying the word itself. And even once I knew I was bi, I would often just kind of explain my kind of experience and hope that people kind of understood it. You know, so, but before the BRC, that was kind of my experience. But since then, I feel like I get the opportunity to share about my bisexual identity a lot more. And it's really cool and it's really fun. And it definitely kind of took away a lot of that kind of fear of even like the full word of bisexual sometimes is something that I was afraid to put out there into the world. I would just kind of leave it at bi. But now it's like, it's part of the work that I do. And it's really empowering to be able to have that kind of freedom to say, this is exactly who I am, you know? So yeah, that was my experience.
That is wonderful. And for folks that aren't as familiar, can you just spell out BRC for us?
Of course, BRC, the Bisexual Resource Center. Come check us out at biresource.org.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then Percy, was there anything that you would like to add to that, this part of the conversation? No, that's okay. No. That's awesome. Awesome. So, you know, one of the other things that the article notes is that the show Heartstopper provides a pretty accurate representation of what it's like to be a bi plus young person. But that some of the members of the fandom, people that really enjoy the show, have actually expressed a great deal of biphobia. So thinking about queer inclusive media, in your experience, not just with Heartstopper, but with any show or movie or fandom that you're a part of, have you found that a fandom can ruin an otherwise good experience with queer media? And if so, can you provide an example or two? And Percy, I'd love to start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I feel like things about me give off the vibes of having been in multiple fandoms. I could pull out plenty of examples for this, but the first one that comes to mind is a phenomenon I've seen in quite a few fandoms, where I feel like a lot of fandoms tend to focus more on like specifically like gay male and male relationships. Oftentimes, when I'm trying to find things for perhaps like a side relationship of like women loving women, there's a lot less content for that. And sometimes I've seen people be extremely toxic about certain relationships within the fandom, and it's just very much turned me off from a show. Or they severely misunderstand the piece of media, but it's on a very broad scale. Another example I would use for that specifically is a very much meant to be a horror thriller, not ad like advisable as a proper relationship webcomic called Killing Stalking. And the intention was to be like, look at this relationship, this is very horrific. But a lot of people within the fandom had treated it as like a genuine relationship. And that really turned me off from going into that.
Yeah, thank you. Vincent, is there something that comes to mind for you where a fandom sort of ruined an otherwise good experience?
Yeah, for sure. The first thing that I thought of, I want to say first, didn't necessarily ruin the show for me or my viewing experience, but I have definitely observed this with the fandom of RuPaul's Drag Race, and I've heard time and time again of a lot of malice circulating within that fandom, and that program is essentially the premier showcase of queer culture at that level of distribution. And I think a lot of people are observing a kind of tonal shift within the show as a whole that they credit to the intensity of the fandom. So, yeah, I definitely have observed that. Yeah.
Yeah. And what about you, Mackenzie?
So it is definitely something I've noticed, and I've noticed it from a couple different perspectives. So, for example, shows like Heartstopper, movies like Red, White, and Royal Blue, a few things that are out now that are not necessarily for young adults. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but that are written softer. They are not as adult themed. They are a little bit more, I don't want to say innocent, but a little bit more youth focused. Shows like Steven Universe, for example. There are some people within kind of the queer community and queer viewers of it saying, well, this show is not accurate. People saying Heartstopper is not an accurate portrayal of what sexuality and romantic orientation can be like for young queer men. That's completely different when there are so many different ways to experience sexuality and romantic orientation. And so there's kind of a level of toxicity where it's become kind of discourse about whether a show or a piece of media can be something for everyone, and if it is too quote unquote innocent or youth focused or child appropriate, then it's not accurate, and that somehow diminishes the importance of having some of that media, despite the fact that there are pieces of non-queer media that do the same thing that also would not be quote unquote accurate of what life is like as an adult. But I also think that there is kind of a flip side to it as well about media that is maybe even not even intentionally queer coded, but I think of movies like the Pixar film Luca. I think about some of Taylor Swift's lyrics, for example. I think of some of these different things that play out where some queer fans of a piece of media or of an artist or something might look at it and say, hey, it's interesting that Luca and Alberto in the movie Luca are colored in the same color as the Men Loving Men flag. It's interesting that there's a lot of metaphors about kind of hiding yourself and not being willing to show yourself in that movie, in some lyrics and some of these things. And in turn, a lot of people who don't pick up on those signals, who don't see some of that coding, again, maybe even unintentionally, saying, oh, there's no chance that they would make a kids movie that is about a queer sea monster. That would be quote unquote inappropriate. Or there's no chance that an artist like Taylor Swift would write lyrics that were queer. And it becomes this weird toxic thing where we as queer people have kind of had to learn how to pick up on some of these signs, and people who don't share our identities sometimes don't see them at all, sometimes completely miss them, which is par for the course. But then it's that toxicity of saying there's no chance this could happen, and it's wrong of you to look at this, especially when looking at children's media, saying you should be looking at it this way, which I think then kind of betrays that they have outdated views of queerness as well. But it's kind of an interesting double-edged sword when it comes to queer inclusion in media.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's there were some really excellent insights from all of you, and I again thank you for being willing to be a part of this conversation. And in slightly sort of better news, or in reverse of that, have you ever had the opposite happen to you, where maybe the showrunners or the people creating a piece of media weren't getting it perfect, they weren't getting it just right, but the fans and the fandom actually made it a more enjoyable experience for you as somebody who identified as a part of the LGBTQ plus community? And Vincent, why don't we start with you for this one?
For sure. So this was an interesting question for me, especially as an artist. I kind of like to stay true to my own taste in films. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily like to be swayed by the general opinions of like a demographic and stuff. But nonetheless, that's to say that I feel like a lot of the queer media that I do experience, if I love it, I love it, and if I feel less than love for it, then that's the case, you know. So that's my personal experience. I kind of enjoy what I enjoy. But I know that many other queer people have a very different experience, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Percy, how about you?
For sure. I cannot express them many times. I've seen a show and I'm like, I feel like these characters should be queer. And then I run over to all the fan works and the art, and everyone else is like, I agree with you. I agree with you. Me too. And I feel like fandom can be a powerful tool for, in further enjoyment of a show and further analysis of it. Because even if the showrunners are doing everything correctly, I've found a lot of like fulfillment in talking to other queer people in fandom who are like, here is every hidden detail that the showrunners put in, here is my interpretation of this character's like scenes and sexuality, and just that like togetherness of community, even if sometimes the show sucks, is something really fulfilling.
Yeah. Yeah, and Mackenzie was sharing some of those details that when I watched Luca, I didn't pick up on. So it's interesting that people can provide that additional insight. Now, Mackenzie, how about you? Is there anything that comes to mind as maybe they weren't getting it right, but the fandom really helped you enjoy a piece more than you might have otherwise?
Not exactly that situation, but I think that one real kind of key example of the phenomenon we're talking about is actually, bewilderingly enough, Harry Potter. I think that, we now can look back in retrospect and see a lot of the things that J.K. Rowling did wrong from the get that we didn't really notice in the first place until she went far right. But I think that because so many people write so much about it and write fan fiction and analyze it and can include these different identities kind of retrospectively in their own version of what this franchise is, I think that that's created a space for a lot of people that didn't exist before, because it just wasn't something in the author's mind, especially at the time of writing the books. But I think that is something that's one reason why a lot of people that I know who are queer and who are trans and non-binary have struggled with their relationship to this series, because they built a community with other fans that really had very little to do with the books themselves, because there's so much to build around it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I do want to move on, because as we all know, queerness is underrepresented in media, and particularly in media focused on young people, on children and young adults and coming of age stories. And this is especially true for bisexuality. And so I'm just wondering if you all have any insights that you'd like to share on why you think creators might be reluctant to include bi plus identities in the work that they are creating, and why does this seem more prevalent in youth-focused media, that we shy away from the possibility of a character being bi plus? Mackenzie, do you want to get us started for this one?
So I think in general, just in regards to queerness itself, it is so over-sexualized and hypersexualized and seen as just that aspect of life, when it is about so much more, as we all know. And I think that then when we look at youth-focused media, because there is that misinterpretation, that over-sexualization, a lot of people think, well, this just isn't appropriate for kids, despite the fact that they might have, heterosexual romances or anything in their shows, and those are not inherently sexualized. So I think that that's a general thing that is misinterpreted and that has kind of been reinforced over time in youth media, unfortunately. I think that we look at bisexuality specifically, and even within the queer community, bisexuality is often over-sexualized as well. And so I think it's just kind of a compounding situation where youth-focused media is already a bit reluctant to handle queerness, and so they are definitely going to be with an identity that they consider to be extra hypersexualized. And I think that is... And I think that beyond that, it's also bisexuality is misunderstood in other ways as well. And so creators don't necessarily know how to include it. And they don't understand that there are so many different stories that can be told, including bi characters. They also think that young people aren't going to understand their own identity, despite the fact that many people know that they're bi at a very young age and that there are definitely age-appropriate stories that can be told.
Thank you, Mackenzie. What about you, Vincent?
Yeah, Mackenzie definitely was spot on with that interpretation. So that was incredible. I think from a production standpoint, I think it was probably hard for the industry to figure out how to tell a bisexual story in such a limited amount of time. And I think obviously there's a large and influential population of people who have only ever experienced attraction towards one gender. So they need a lot of context and kind of straightforward storytelling to fully understand that a bisexual character's experience can be more than just a stepping stone or a detour, or isn't that at all, you know? And I think for a long time, and Mackenzie kind of touched on this a little bit, there was just a lot of depictions of bisexuality that kind of enforced a lot of negative stereotypes, and I think writers kind of needed to experiment and find a way to set up and present these characters in a consistently positive and uplifting way. And I think it's even more focused on youth media because I think on one side there's a certain population of parents who would have a reaction if a heteronormative presenting character entered a queer relationship. And then sadly, there's also biphobia in the LGBTQIA plus community, where there's a small subsection of people who would question why a queer presenting character would enter a heteronormative relationship and not consider bisexuality in that equation.
Yeah.
But I think as these shows that we're discussing today are proving to us, there's a way to kind of walk that line and tell a powerful story while doing it. So.
Yeah. Then Vincent, when you were talking, I was actually thinking of all of the times that I myself did the she's bi actually when thinking about Willow on Buffy, which I've mentioned on this show a number of times. So thank you for reminding me of that reality too.
Of course.
Now, Percy, I think knowing the amount of time we have left, you're gonna get the last word.
Oh boy. Well, yeah, I think Mackenzie and Vincent covered quite a bit of the reasons why we don't see a lot of bi representation in youth media. I feel like a lot of shows now are doing very well with trying to represent that a little more when they do represent it. A show I hold very near and dear to me is The Owl House, which does feature a bisexual protagonist. And I think that show does a very good job of showing off Luce's bisexuality and making it like understandable and appropriate for that age level, which I think is the fear that a lot of people have, that it will somehow be inappropriate or the reputation of bi people in media has been very like promiscuous, and so that's essentially what Mackenzie was saying, but part of why you don't see that much representation, but it's possible to do it right. People just need to put in the effort to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being with us. I hope that you all have an opportunity to celebrate bisexuality this month with Bisexual Plus Week coming up and celebrate Bisexuality Day at the end of September. Thank you for being with us. I hope to see you all again on the show, and I'm going to wrap us up. All right, and thank you everybody for joining us for Something to Talk About Live in this new monthly format. We will see you on the first Thursday in October, and we will see you soon. Thanks so much.